Hello, everyone. This is Craig, and what you are about to listen to is the live event that we conducted with Stuart Kendall at Public Records for the Durations Festival on November 11th, 2024. The title of Stuart's talk is The Headless Politics of Georges Bataille, where we undergo an investigation of the concepts of excess, heterology, the festival, and much more. But before we get on to that, I just want to remind you that if you are listening in November of 2024, our Acephalus Kickstarter campaign is still going. We're just about halfway there, maybe even just over the hump. So go into the show notes, click the Kickstarter link, and please support us today. We are within 12 days of finishing this campaign. Okay, let's head to the live event. I want to introduce Stuart Kendall. Thank you for coming here tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah, and go ahead. Maybe pull your mic a little bit closer.
A little closer? Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be back, and I'm thrilled to be live, to be living in these times, if that's one way to put it. So I just shut up. Craig asked me to talk about politics and Georges Bataille. We conceived of this several months ago. We found out what date this would happen on somewhat later. But it turned out to be timely, let's say. So thinking about Bataille and politics, many topics are going to come up. What I'd like to do is maybe outline sort of the core of his thinking on this issue, in the terminology that he was working through, and then touch upon his thoughts about the sort of major political trends of his era, which of course reflect some of the major political trends of our era. The heart of this is a conflict between his thoughts about conflict, or not conflict, but his thoughts about communism, which is to say any left-leaning or progressive way of thinking about social organization. And of course, his thoughts about fascism. And drawing mostly from his writings in the 1930s about fascism, in particular his essay on the psychological structure of fascism. So I'm going to apologize right now for using the word fascism and using it a lot, I think, maybe using it too quickly. I'm going to be talking primarily in a historical manner, but if we find relevance to the events of our times, then we are going to find some relevance to the events of our times. And I think that Bataille's writing on these topics is very, very helpful in helping us frame the issues of our day. In the end, though, what I want to leave us with is the idea of the festival. What is a festival? How does the festival live within society? What are we doing in a festival? Why is the festival necessary? So this is a great place and time to think about that. But that said, we can, in a Q&A moment later, we can go wherever we want to take this conversation. But to lay down some sort of basic terms, what is Georges Bataille? What is this thinker primarily concerned with? He's primarily concerned with the problem of excess and expenditure. What he wants to do is find a social structure that will permit the glorious rather than the catastrophic use of wealth. And this is wealth of all kinds, of energy, a bodily energy, of the resources of the earth, of the energy that we get from the sun. It's all forms of energy and their disposition. But what do we do with this energy? Do we just squander it, waste it, turn it into garbage and ship it to Staten Island? Do we find a way to do something with it, with ourselves? What can it produce for us? How can it bring us together? How can it tear us apart? This is his main quest, and the terms that he uses to think about this problem shift over the years. So if you pick up some of his writing from the 1930s, you're going to see terms like homogeneity and heterogeneity. If you read some of his writing from the 1950s, you're going to see terms like servitude and sovereignty, and some other terms that are associated with Bataille fit into these paradigms as well. words like acifal. So reading Bataille, to a certain extent, involves picking apart his terms, figuring out where he borrowed these terms from, whether it's from Nietzsche or Hegel or Marquis de Sade, Freud, but also when he wrote what he wrote and where he was taking his thought or trying to take his thought. In the 1930s, Bataille was an active political militant of a certain kind. He never joined the Communist Party. He was part of an oppositional communist group, but he was trying to change society. So he wrote in a polemic tone. He wrote internal documents for various groups that he was part of, and a lot of his writing was not published during his lifetime. Things that we find most fascinating now were not published in his lifetime. Even things that he that we really celebrate now, something like his novel Blue of Noon. He wrote it in 1935, but didn't publish it until 1957. So there's this strange feature of reading Bataille's work where we have to sift through when he wrote it and why he wrote it and for whom he wrote it and what tone he wrote it in and these kinds of things. And again, where do these terms come from? As I was saying, in the 1930s, he uses terms like homogeneity and heterogeneity to think about social structures. And what he means by terms like these are the things that are binding individual beings together, but also whole societies. Things that that organize us, but also tear us apart. So a term like homogeneity is a way of expressing a group that brings itself together under bonds of some kind of shared, ultimately equality, some kind of exchangeability, some similarity. Some of that could be rooted in, traditional forms, something like family structure, mode of work. It could be any number of things that bind people together into a homogeneous group. But of course, the homogeneous group is a figment of our imagination. We are all different, and nothing stays the same. So we may dream of homogeneity, but nothing will stay homogeneous for long. It's threatened from above and below and within. And that is where this notion of heterogeneity comes to bear. If the homogeneous is a group that is remarkably similar or longs for similarity, those heterogeneous elements are those things that either rise up from the group, wherein wealth is gathered around a particular individual. They become so wealthy that they threaten the stability of the group, or the things that maybe are sinking so far down into the bottom, whether it's through poverty or something else that threatens this group from below. In any case, homogeneity and heterogeneity, both deeply unstable and threatened from within in each case, and threatening to us. So even thinking about those terms for Bataille is an unstable and unsettling space of reflection for him. To think about union or homogeneity, to think about being in a homogeneous group can bring horror to us. The idea of utterly losing our identity to become undifferentiated or part of an undifferentiated mass. For some people, that is, that strikes deep, deep terror. This sense of union could be the ultimate nightmare. On the other hand, heterogeneity, to be entirely other, to be cast out, whether it's above, below, or beside, to be a threat like that. The heterogeneous, this thing that cannot be incorporated, cannot be known, that too is a threat. We're afraid of the heterogeneous. We don't necessarily like it in our experience. We want measured doses. So what Bataille's looking for in social structures is a way to think about these measured doses of the homogeneous, the heterogeneous, the things that we can appropriate and the things that we need to expel, the times when we can appropriate and the times when we can expel. So what are these social structures? Again, as I was saying, Bataille is looking at social structures that are very similar to social structures that we think about today. Here we're thinking about economic models, but also ideological frameworks. So he's dealing with communism in the 1930s. He's dealing with fascism in its flower at that time. There are other elements to it, but essentially those kinds of social structures. He's thinking about the religious influence on society, a place of Christianity or Islam, as it plays into the fabric of both of these other motifs. In thinking about communism, Bataille says some surprising things. He equates communism and capitalism very much, because both communism and capitalism look at the world of matter and transform it into useful things. Both communism and capitalism come out of a rational, modernist, functionalist, utilitarian tradition. Capitalism doesn't quite get there. It still has a space of instability and inequality, let's say, to be to understate the matter, perhaps catastrophically. In any case, communism dreams of doing away with that, and so Bataille's writing against the background of Stalinism, and that frames his reflections on communism and where it goes, what it is. But for him, Stalinism becomes the ultimate identification of the individual, or the servitude of the individual within the state. The individual is lost utterly. The meaning of the individual is lost within the power of the state. The state becomes the hyper-rationalist fantasy of utter functionalism. And for Bataille, this is an utter nightmare. Communism does not permit the kind of freedom that he longs for, the freedom that he calls sovereignty. So communism is too rational and doesn't give us a space for freedom. Fascism, on the other hand, and again, thinking of this article from the fall of 1933, the year that Hitler came to power, the psychological structure of fascism. Fascism finds a way to incorporate the affective and emotional power of the festival into a social structure. It does that by having a homogeneous social group that can identify with a charismatic leader who is heterogeneous to that group. And this leader can stand above the group, and the members of the group, though they are come from many disparate, backgrounds, different functions, different purposes, they can come together in their identification with this leader, who, as I say, is heterogeneous to the group. And his very heterogeneity is part of his appeal. The fact that he is not like the members of that mass makes him untouchable. This leader, this heterogeneous leader of the fascist party, can do all manner of extraordinary things. And here I find this utterly fascinating when we're thinking about Bataille. This leader can do all manner of things to set themselves apart. They don't play by the rules. They can lie, they can cheat, they can defraud, they can do any number of things that proves that they have a power that other people don't have. The mass, the homogeneous mass, can be excited about that. That power exists, and I'm on its side. But they don't need to have it, because that guy has it. And the more that guy does things that don't fit into the norm, the more powerful he becomes. And this is absolutely extraordinary. But what it allows for in this psychological moment of identification is a release, a gathering of force, an affective force, and a passionate mode of fanatical following that's at the core of the fascist union, right? Because we should think about the word fascism and what it means. It means bringing together. So there's a powerful union in fascism that permits the festival. And that means also the capacity to create myths, things that transcend rationalism, that are utterly irrational, that exceed science, which becomes irrelevant. So on the one hand, you have communism, which is rooted in scientific rationalism, in persuasion. But science is also the language of definition. It's the language of division. So it's not the space in which we create myths, in which our passions are evoked. Communism in that way can be boring. It's hard to get behind a leader on the left and get excited about it. Because what do they have? They have persuasion. On the right, on the other hand, we have passion. We have affect. We have mythology. So what do? We have to find a place for the festival, a place for the excess, the overflow in our lives. We have to find a way to balance it. Bataille, writing about the festival in his book Theory of Religion, makes it clear that the festival is not something that goes on forever. The festival is an upsurge of energies. It's a place where the rules are broken, where people sing instead of speak, where people dance instead of sit. The festival is the place where we let ourselves loose. So we need to find a place for that. We need to find a place for that in our objects, in our lives, in our week. This is what Bataille is looking for. He wants to have a place for that type of release, that excess. And he wants to think about how it is related to politics. Because when politics becomes a festival, when we lose ourselves in politics, we can have fascism. We can get lost in that party atmosphere. So we need to find another outlet for the festival, another place for it in society. In his early writings about revolution, when Bataille is thinking more in terms of communist revolution, he talks about the life after the revolution. And he says it will include both things. It will include the day-to-day world, the profane world, the functional world, the keeping the lights on. But it will also have a place where we can let go. It'll have a place for the festival. That element of the festival comes in all manner of aspects of our lives. But it's also this thing wherein we have no leader, but we don't lose ourselves utterly in objectification, in the rational, but we come into a meeting wherein there's conversation and tumult. He calls it acidhorizonresearchcommons because it's headless, but he talks about polycephality, bicephality. Anytime when there's a way that we can have dialogue that is more open than just either a leader or a singular idea, as in the idea of the state. That's the kind of political formation that Bataille calls, an atheological community. It's not centered in one thing or person. It's a conversation that opens in many directions. And that's the kind of community that he imagines.
Great. I guess one of the first questions that I would have is, let's just flash forward to the present day. And we don't have to go too deep. I know, we're already... Well, here, I'll say this in advance. We recently recorded another episode with a friend of ours online, and the topic was somewhat close on domination and hegemony. And we just found ourselves kind of processing this current political moment, this effluvium of thoughts and feelings. And I will do my best to rein that in a little bit. But here we are in 2024, and we live in a world, ostensibly, at least on paper, is neither communist nor fascist. Yet political liberalism, neoliberalism, has not been able to find a way, of course, to realize any of the vision of society that Bataille had envisioned. And I mean, arguably, in some respects, and so the argument goes is that liberalism becomes the handmaiden of a kind of fascism over time. And critics of Bataille, especially from the left, the communist left, the Marxist left in particular, will point to Bataille saying, well, what you are doing is you are inviting or you're encouraging a kind of liberalism that leaves in place all of the apparatuses and all of the other machinations that have brought into birth our neoliberal society today. And so I think there is the provocation of Bataille, but there's also this challenge as well. So given, the sort of narrative about Bataille that we spelled out here tonight, and given the current state of affairs in the world of global capitalism, neoliberalism, or whatever this is called right now, how do you think Bataille can allow us to achieve that intervention? Or, are there modest ways? Are there big ways? Without being too prescriptive about it, what do you think perhaps he would think?
Well, I think what I've been doing for the past couple of minutes is sketching sort of a vast picture, really just looking at the big buckets of Bataille's thought. But he is a person who's very interested in smaller details of life. And I think that that's the thing that he would help us to look toward. His major books include things like The Accursed Share and, Sovereignty, which are these things that look at social structures, and they're trying to find ways of organizing the spectacle of waste so that we have a deeper, that we have more of a cathartic experience of it. So one thing he would do, I think now, is continue to look at that problem, right? We hide our waste. We hide our expenditure. We don't see luxury today. We don't see the value of our goods. We have things, we don't know what they mean. We don't interact with the objects of our world with any passion or sensitivity, for the most part. This is why I often talk about design and design culture and the objects of our world and how we might interact with them. I think that if Bataille was writing today, he would be interested in these kinds of problems. I think we'd also be interested in the fact that so many of our decisions are tracked and observed. It's a one-click sort of universe. We are watched as we click,
right?
And commodified. And it becomes ever more smooth and flowing. So we don't notice the exchanges that we are part of. Whereas that's very much part of what Bataille's trying to get us to do, is to see and to feel and to experience those things so that they have value to us. So I believe that he would be helping us find ways to build an awareness of that into our tools. And here I mean tools like our iPhone. How can we build pleasure into these things rather than just building a sort of blind, smooth exchangeability, sort of a flow into it. And then, some of his other writings, things like Inner Experience, Guilty, and On Nietzsche, they're political books, but they're rooted in personal meditation. They're rooted in a way of living that is sensitive to the sovereignty or freedom that we can experience in all of our minute experiences. And some of our greatest, our ecstasies, our physical passions. But, for Bataille, returning us to that way, that very intimate way of living. He says that religion is the search for lost intimacy. And that intimacy is not just intimacy between lovers. It's the intimacy that we have with all things. It's learning how to live in a material way. Bataille's notion of base materialism is about cleansing us of all idealism, all the abstract, everything that takes us out of this visceral moment that we're in. and bringing us into that. So I think those are things that don't have anything to do with the biggest picture of, communism, fascism, and neoliberalism.
Right.
But they have to do with strategies. I think Foucault would say, techniques of subjectivity, ways that we can engage deeply, intimately with the world, but also how to balance that. How do we manage that? Because we need both. We need the momentary, the ephemeral, the passing. We need that, but we also need the lasting. And finding ways to balance these two things is part of what Bataille's interested in.
And one of the things that I think is unique about Bataille, and the reason he's useful, which you already brought up, is he identifies a kind of alienation that occurs at the level of consumption.
Yeah.
But the Bataille of 1933, when he's writing the essay on fascism, is starting from a Marxist framework. And he's saying that, look, it's wage labor. It's the exploitation of the wage. And perhaps this is one of the sort of ways that Marx and Marxism itself was somewhat blinkered, because they could not see desire. But at the same time, I think, how does Bataille reconcile the alienation that happens within consumption with the alienation that occurs at the level of exploitation via wage labor? Does he carry that through his work, through his writing of The Accursed Share, or is there a way to sort of reconcile both ends of that alienation for him?
So he is very much interested in the problem of, as I was saying earlier, the notion of equality, the equal, the same, the homogeneous, has to do with homogeneity and exchangeability of things. When we turn our materials into things or objects of exchange, they have a kind of, obviously exchangeability. They're a thing that we can buy. We can buy it with the money that we earned from our wage labor. Right. And when we earn that wage labor, we are equal to any other worker. And so both sides of that, both the material form of it, the thing itself, is horrifying to Bataille, and the experience of being turned into that individual who is an exchangeable individual. Any worker or system in which the worker can be replaced with any other worker. And here, I'm horrified by that. Right. But it's a thing that even in noble enterprises, we think about. I think about. Obviously, I've had a sort of career in the academy, in which case, teachers are exchangeable. Any teacher's regarded as the same teacher, which is utterly opposed to the way that Bataille would think about it. I think a great quote for me is from Nietzsche when he says, "Mine is not the voice for your ears," which means that the teacher for you has got to speak to you. That there's a specific kind of meeting, and that's not exchangeable. Not every teacher is the same. Not every class is the same. Every meeting of people is different. So that's the thing that we can push against, that Bataille pushes against, from both those angles. But another thing that I think that's really a challenge in thinking about what Bataille is trying to do in the 1930s is he's looking at the problem of community as it's related to political structures. And he doesn't have a good answer for the question, how does community come about?
Right.
He really fails to answer that question, and ultimately comes up with a notion of a community in which no one has anything in common, in which we have to ask what we have in common at all times. This is the atheological community. But to see him struggling in those writings from the 1930s, particularly in that moment of militancy, when he's examining the idea of class struggle and trying to figure out how that could actually come about. How could class consciousness emerge? And so he kicks around a whole bunch of ideas in unpublished writings. He thinks about abjection. He says, maybe the workers, as they are pushed down through their very oppression, will form a class unit. But he rejects that. No, they will not. they will find other ways to avoid thinking about how they belong to that. And this is the ground of fascism. But maybe there's another way that people will come together as a group. He considers the idea of anxiety. Maybe our shared existential dread will bring us together. And we can become a different kind of unit based on dread. Ultimately, that too is not going to be enough to bring us together. He considers the idea of elective affinities. Maybe we can join a group because we choose to do so. But that too fails. So he doesn't have complete answers. And I think we find that over and over again in his work, particularly, toward the end when his illness overwhelmed his ability to complete the works that he dreamed of completing. So reading Bataille is a challenge in that regard, because it's unfinished thought.
Right.
Even books that we have in, some of the books that we have in English are hard to read for this. They don't include all of the materials that are available, or the status of the book is unclear to us. We read words on a page and we think, oh, he meant this. But he might have been trying it out. He was looking for the idea rather than having found it. So reading with that sort of sensitivity to the search, I think is important.
Maybe I'll ask one more question before we bring Will up he'll be the moderator for the Q&A, and I'll be going around if you have questions for Stuart. I'm really interested in the idea of the festival, and one thing that stood out for me tonight is that under fascism and with the rise of a fascist leader, you have a kind of investment of desire where the festival takes place with it circumscribed by the political in some sense. And the way that I heard you tonight, and this, of course, is an idea I've encountered in Bataille before, but it just rings a little bit differently here tonight, which is the opposite or antithesis of that would be to find a way of expressing ourselves, our desire, our thoughts, our passions outside of the frame of the political. How does that work for Bataille? And given that this problem, and maybe I'm going to put this out there for you too, Stuart, given that we are now at a moment in history where this problem is repeating itself again, where is it that we are coming up short? Where is it that Bataille would see we are failing? Did Bataille reflect on these failures, or at least did he remain committed to a certain kind of structure or axiom by which we would turn out of that tendency? Or do you see it? If Bataille doesn't have it, what is your take on that?
Well, I guess part of what I'm thinking about, or have been thinking about lately, in regard to this issue, maybe this isn't a direct answer to that, but is what I'll call the rational use of irrational violence. So Bataille is particularly interested in the irrational, the affective bonds, the fanaticism. He's also interested in even more, let's say, radical forms of irrational violence. And in here, I'm thinking about the notion of the amok, someone like that. He talks about Andre Breton saying that the most extreme, or the purest surrealist act is to file randomly into a crowd. And for Breton, that's just like it's just like an armchair sort of joke. But in certain places around the world, people will do this. They run into a crowd with a knife, and they, and this
we're not recommending that.
We're not endorsing it. But the thing about that is, in that tradition, what happens to those people? They're killed by that mob.
Yeah.
So that type of irrational violence is a thing that exists in the world, and that Bataille tries to grapple with in a real and not just literary way. And find examples of it. But when we think about the rational use of irrational violence, and here I'm thinking of things like riots and pogroms, wherein a state actor could promote, or would-be state actor, could promote angry mob to do all manner of things, to serve the rational political ends that they hope to achieve. And they may not necessarily have a precise endpoint, the mere existence of that irrational violence can serve to excite other passions. It can become the basis of that community. And so it can serve this rational purpose. And so there is this challenge between those two things. How do we find a place for that affective bonds, that irrational upsurge? That's what Bataille is interested in, without circumscribing it to the machinations of power, to have it be taken over by the state or the would-be state. So that's something that he's very keenly interested in. But again, it's a thing that he doesn't have a clear answer for. Right. The closest he gets to writing about this topic is in materials that are unpublished, once again.
Are you going to translate them?
We shall see. I'm very eager to take on projects.
Well, with that said, let's give Stuart a round of applause for the presentation. I'm going to bring Will up, and I will be going around with... We know that Will has a tendency to go on and on, so don't keep us till 11. But no, Will will come up and ask a couple of questions, and then just kind of get your questions going, and I'll go around after Will is done.
So I won't take too long. Because we are addressing Bataille in a time of, let's say, tumult. Globally. What we're seeing is a rejection of, they say, incumbents, right? The political analysts are saying, oh, it's a global rejection of incumbent leadership. But of course, it's a rightward lurch. And it's being matched with the consolidation of power in Hungary, right? Meloni is kind of trying to do this, but finding some limitation at the level of the juridical. What is one thing we can understand about conspiracy in a time of political tumultuousness? Because ultimately what draws people to Bataille, with full respect, the importance of texts like The Cradle of Humanity, Sovereignty, etc., is really the College of Sociology. And the intensity of the liturgy that this group really tried to live by, in a certain sense, at least at the level of thought. And I'm wondering what is the space of conspiracy in the face of this, right? We've had works published like the Conspiracist Manifesto. We're seeing a return of nom de plume now as well, or various anonymous organizations publishing. And I'm assuming we'll only see an acceleration of this in the coming years. But what place does conspiracy have in Bataille, and what place does conspiracy have in the face of at least an attempted a symbolism of domination? I don't want to get too ahead of myself with, a second Trump presidency. It's really a pathetic symbolism of domination. So, yeah.
Well, there's a lot in what you just said, as usual. And so I'm not sure how much I want to push back on various elements of it, because I will just say that, people ask me questions about Bataille a lot. And they ask me all kinds of questions, so there's a lot of different people have very different kind of Batailles that they read. Some people really have only read the novels, and that's all that they care about. Other people read, purely the sort of social anthropology or the art history.
Yikes.
So it's I give talks in different places, and I meet a different audience each time. So Bataille is fascinating as a thinker because he speaks so differently to so many different people, but the core of what he's doing is wrapped tightly. So he's thinking about a lot of different things. So I'll throw that in your ear, and we'll say there's not just one Bataille, and we need to think about how that works. You can have your favorite, but even having your favorite Bataille is not very Bataillean.
I don't know if I have a Bataille, but
Yeah. So in any case, this will to the conspiracy is a, and that's a joke, but this thing about belief that you're asking about, I think is a important question. I was saying earlier that for Bataille, communism and let's say the progressive tendency, the left tendency, is rooted in the modern era. It's rooted in scientific rationalism, and here I'm thinking sort of in the best possible world. But this is the language of division. This is the language of definition. This is the language of rational, reason, ratio. It's this kind of stuff. And that does not lend itself to the power of myth. The use of language in a mythic and religious way. And here, I mean that in the poetic sense, using language that is metaphorical. And obviously Bataille writes poetry. He's written about poetry. Mm-hmm. He has a way of thinking about poetry that's not particularly original. Poetry for him is just words that mean more than one thing, wherein it's a sacrifice of language because the singular meaning of a word is lost in the multiple meanings of a word. And so the mythos, this poetic space of language is a space of multiple meanings, of hidden meanings, of secret meanings, of the esoteric. And that is this space that you're thinking of. It's this thing that we need, the affective power of language. This is something that Bataille is seeking. How do we write about this festival in a way that is comprehensible and makes sense, that serves the discursive purpose of language, but is also open to the passions? This is a challenge for him, and he writes in different genres, partly in a search for this kind of a language. He's trying to come up with, in the 1930s, he's trying to come up with a new myth, acidhorizonresearchcommons. Mm-hmm. And he wants that to be a galvanizing myth. And there's much more to say about it. But what I'm interested in here is this way of using language, this mythic way of using language, this poetic way of using language that allows us to come together in that language from many different directions and find a union of belief there that is, as you're saying, extremely dangerous. So the fascist leader is able to use words and phrases in such a poetic, myth-making manner that they become mantras, chants, things that rise above, let's say, mere kind of propaganda, or just like a catchphrase. We can be rational speakers and have a memorable catchphrase, but to have a phrase that takes on this power of suggesting an entire worldview, that is this power of conspiracy and myth. And I'm also thinking about the fact that this affective identification with the heroic, heterogeneous leader, this is modeled on a certain form of religious belief. Right. And among those, adherents, we have people who, let's say, are inclined to believe, to fall into that structure, to embrace that structure, to feel at home in that structure. So there's a certain tendency to want there to be more, to believe in more. So it's dangerous, but powerful, possibly necessary.
And there's got to be some sort of point to be made here that the power of refrain, especially in liturgy, right, especially in glorification, the Catholic notion of glorification, we see revived in the arrival of the Führer, right, or Il Duce, right. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, these refrains from the absolute outside of those political political movements, whether they be, chants of the last 5 years in various political struggles, or the reducing to parody of the enemy's liturgy. I'm also kind of interested in the relationship between sort of language and liturgy in Bataille, because he's writing in a time when, you've got Otto Cassel writing about the liturgical and the political. You've really got the final form of Carl Schmitt and his theory of the Führer. And in the midst of all of this, you have the admiration of a politics of extreme affective intensity. And in what ways do we see in things like the College of Sociology at least a model, like a coming together that isn't predicated on the necessity for exclusion or for some sort of esoteric, circumscriptive political project that just posits itself as counterpower, or I'm always very worried about the return to the esoteric and this revival of a particular kind of vitalism that we were speaking about before. But at the same time, we would be remiss not to give an articulation of it. And perhaps that's something that Bataille is trying to do, that there has to be some sort of political, I hate this word, but political use to understanding these weapons more fully.
Ultimately, I think part of the, I don't want to use the word confusion here necessarily, but to be absolutely precise about the College of Sociology, right? Bataille founded Counterattack with Andre Breton in Surrealist group. So it's dissident communists and the Surrealists in the fall of 1935, trying to find a solution to the problem of fascism, find an affective path, a search for a new myth. This fails due to internal squabbles between Bataille and Breton, and leads Bataille to found Acefal, which he doesn't quite know, where it's going, what it is, any of these things. It begins as a search for myth in 1936. By spring of 1937, he's meeting with other people. So Roger Caillois and Michel Larice is eventually going to join this. And this is the beginning of the College of Sociology, which starts meeting in the fall of 1937, at which point the nature and composition of Acefal has changed radically. And it went from being a sort of sociological study group to being a genuine secret society in the fall of 1937. And that's the moment when that sociological study group is born as the College of Sociology. So it becomes the exoteric form of the esoteric Acefal. But the groups do not overlap a great deal. So the central figures in the College of Sociology, aside from Bataille, do not participate in Acefal. They are talking about other things. It's related, it's the outward form of this reflection, but it's not the inner practice of it, which is what we have in Acefal. And then we should also note that the College of Sociology, like many of Bataille's ventures, fails. It fails not just because World War II interrupts it, but because of the internal dissensions within the group. Michel Larice argues that Bataille's interpretation of Marcel Mauss is inaccurate, because Bataille is interested in promoting certain forms of social activity over others, whereas Marcel Mauss praises the total social fact. He is interested in a broad range of things, Mauss is, and Larice argues, in a way that Bataille is not. Bataille promotes the heterogeneous. Roger Caillois also has a very distinct view of what they should be doing in the College of Sociology. He studies things from the outside in a way that Bataille does not. Roger Caillois is also, let's admit, interested in a kind of aristocracy,
Yeah.
So Bataille is more to the left, and
Certainly than Kaiwa.
yeah, Roger Caillois is certainly on the right. In any case, College of Sociology is not a unified body. It's a body that falls apart and fails. It's attempting to do a thing, which is to study how society is formed, and that this is related to the concerns that I've been outlining in terms of Bataille's work. But Acefal is the place wherein he's really trying to put that into practice. But this too fails. And just to bring it kind of into a close on this notion of Acefal, there's an evolution at the very end of Acefal when it moves from being concerned with how do we gain adherence, what is it to join a group? What are the rituals of initiation or this kind of thing, to what sort of practices of meditation do we need to have? So in 1938, Bataille begins to practice meditation under the influence of various teachers and in various traditions, so that by 1939, he's fully absorbed in this practice of meditation. And this has to do with the way that he begins writing meditational texts. So the meditational texts that you see in a thing like The Practice of Joy Before Death are not poems. They are meditational texts. They're texts that we can read as we think about the structure of the universe and think about our place within it, that can bring us to the edge of this joy before death. So it's meditation. It goes into this place of liturgy that you're talking about, and it is related to this search for myth, to be sure. But Bataille abandons that as well, and he shifts over, after he meets Maurice Blanchot, into writing poetry. So the meditation takes a different form and is surfaced socially in a different form. Bataille publishes the Meditations only in a limited circulation document, but he publishes poems as poems. So there's a shift in what he's doing and who he's doing it with and for. But
we're going to move to the general Q&A now.
Yeah, just checking my mic over here, and we have a question in the front, and I'm going to be that guy going around with the cable, so please be careful.
Hello. So may I ask 2 questions? Is that allowed?
Is it okay if you ask 2 questions?
Yeah. So major historians of fascism have now started to openly call Donald Trump fascist, like Robert Paxton.
Yeah.
But one of the criticisms of that label has been, he doesn't really have a vision for American government that's fascist, and that, it's not just a mode like populism. So I'm wondering what you think of that criticism, and I'm also wondering if you can elaborate on how, you said the fascist leader can just kind of act with impunity and do whatever they want, and they're sort of celebrated for this, for violating norms. And we see this very much in Donald Trump, and I'm wondering if you can talk about that.
Yeah, at the beginning of this, I apologize for using the word fascist, because I think we use it a little bit too quickly. We can too quickly think about, sort of the powerful leader, the bootstrap, all this kind of stuff, as though that's what it's really all about. And I don't think that is what, in my interpretation, that's not exactly what Donald Trump is interested in or capable of doing. He's a disorganized mess as a person mentally and as a businessman, in any manner. However, when we think about Bataille's writing about fascism and this heterological figure, I find it very interesting because it does help me understand everything that we've been talking about tonight. Helps me understand this present moment, I think, in useful ways. Bataille talking about fascism, he's talking about a kind of a leader that can get these affective bonds by performing the most outrageous stunts, by being a clown. Anything that puts them outside the norm builds their power. And that's the power that we're seeing affected in Trump. The more rambling he is, the the less discursive he is, the less persuasive he is, the more ridiculous he is, the more powerful he becomes. The more he lies, the more he cheats. But he's got other things too. He's like a celebrity. He's got wealth. He does these other things that put him above the norm. But anything that will put him outside the norm is powerful for him. So that he didn't have to do something like revert to persuasion in the final months of his campaign. In fact, he went the other direction. He just reverted to slurs and insults. He went down in that way, in terms of taking his thinking, his logic, and all of that. The more illogical he is, the more powerful he is. That's the power of heterology for Bataille. So I'm using Bataille's notion of his definition of fascism as a way of diagnosing this kind of a figure and this kind of social structure, rather than thinking about it in terms of the mechanisms of power that we see in, that we saw in let's say, the fullest flower of the Nazi regime. We could talk in a different direction about totalitarianism and what that means and its mechanisms. But when we're thinking about fascism and through the lens of Bataille, I think focusing in on this way that the community is formed. And again, remembering that it has to do with this unstable union of various groups. Many people can be part of that coalition and excited to be part of that coalition. They can make all manner of excuses because it's an irrational affective bond. It doesn't have to do with reason or persuasion. And the more, those of us on the left wring our hands and say, oh, but we're not persuading them. They were never going to be persuaded. It's not about that.
All right. Did you have a second question?
I think that was two.
Excellent work. Great. Anyway, yeah. We'll go with you, and then you over there.
This is not going to be popular, but I guess I'm curious if there is a form in the vision of Bataille of a benign fascism that caters to the necessity of mythology that you've been speaking to, and this inevitable creation of myth, and if there's a way. I know he wants to take this outside of politics, but politics are inevitable, so I didn't know if there's outside of the legacy of fascism was as we all interpret it. I didn't know if there's a way to politically cater to mythology in a way that's ultimately benign.
Yeah. So the problem that he has with it is the gathering of power into a singular figure. So it's any recourse to singularity is a problem in Bataille. So that could be the problem in communism, where it's the recourse to the state or to a singular idea. This could be a problem in our thought when we have a recourse to a single discipline or mode of knowing or type of experience. Anytime we prioritize any one thing, Bataille has a problem with that, because all of that limitation cuts us out of the whole of life. So he talks about this in terms of, epistemology, experience, economics, whatever. But in terms of community, it's sort of the ultimate nightmare, having a singular leader who is going to take over all of that and perform all of those functions. So what he proposes as a counter to it is this atheological community. And Acifal is an attempt to theorize and model that. And what this has to do with is creating a space wherein all the members can engage in kind of productive dialogue in the tumult and passion of life. But then, rather than having a singular person maintain themselves as the center of that group, that person who may emerge as a galvanizing force, a central force, might rise up in some way. That person has the power to sacrifice themselves. So Acifal is a sacrificial community wherein the leaders give themselves up or the singular leader. So there's questions about this. Pierre Klosowski says that Bataille called himself the Acéphale, as though he was the singular leader of this. But I believe that Patrick Wahlberg's claim that Bataille asked the members to kill him is true, that he wanted to sacrifice his place in that community to create a myth of self-sacrifice so that people could be strong enough to die, to give up their place in leadership and pass the torch. So the benign element to it is this strong enough to die, to give up, to let go. Are we, the strongest person, according to Nietzsche, is the person who can give the most, give up the most, let go the most. So that's...
That was an excellent question, by the way. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Horizon. Thank you for making it happen. I had a question about more certain preconditions, personal preconditions of Bataille for creating certain groups like Acéphale and specifically the notion of secrecy, those groups. So it's pretty clear that at that time, Bataille was sort of a theoretical heretic for many people around him. People on the left were very afraid of him and didn't want to be in any group with him. Simone Weil is very clear about it. It's very funny. But that almost brought him to the position of an intellectual exile. I don't know if you could see a connection between this secrecy and this notion of exile that almost is echoed in other intellectuals of that time, like Walter Benjamin, who apparently was a member of some group, or either Acéphale, but I'm not sure on that. I was reading something about it. People like Benjamin or people like Agamben, who recently been bringing up the notion of exile, and whether exile exists in Bataille's work, and what is this form? Is it secrecy or the occult?
So you're absolutely correct that Bataille is regarded as a suspect figure already in the 1920s. He doesn't join the Surrealist group because of sort of personal antipathy with André Breton, and we should say that there are reasons for that. Bataille goes to brothels. He gets drunk all the time. He's unreliable. He spends all his money in gambling. So he's not a responsible intellectual or person in that way. And he knows of this about himself too. So there's that kind of that he's a problematic figure. He's not somebody that everybody's going to rush to get behind in that regard. So he does think about that, but he does tend to have a sort of natural leadership qualities. When we read about his public speaking, his ability to speak honestly, over and over again, we have these accounts of people being deeply moved by Bataille talking. So he could be authentic in a way, if I dare to use that term, he could be authentic and moving in a convincing and powerful way. So in that regard, it's not surprising that people would kind of gather around him. And he knew everybody. Paris was a small town in the 1930s. So he could kind of navigate through this shifting terrain, gathering figures to him, as he moves sort of group to group, friends of this person, friends of that person. And yet there's also dissensions. So we shouldn't just say, oh, he was a friend of Bataille's, as though they were friends their entire lives. He was friends with Pierre Klosowski for a very short period in the 1930s, and then they had a contentious and difficult relationship thereafter, though they remained friends of a certain kind. So I'm talking about sort of instabilities here, and kind of constellations. So Walter Benjamin did attend the meetings of the College of Sociology, at least to a certain extent. as did many other people at different times. Something like ASIFAL is very different. We have membership lists of ASIFAL and attendance lists for this kind of thing. But what he was doing in ASIFAL, Bataille, was thinking about the mechanism by which a group is formed. What sort of rituals of initiation do we need to have? How difficult should it be to join a thing, to enter into a thing? What are the barriers to entry? And how do those barriers to entry change the nature of the belonging that we feel in that group? So they were interested in creating barriers to entry to create bonds of cohesion. It's not just I choose to join and then I join. Things must be done. Promises must be made. And that still did not function. He ultimately moved away from that into a into a much more isolated mode of thought. So that in the 1930s or 40s rather, when he has lost his job at the Bibliothèque Nationale in April 1942, he's got no money. He leaves Paris. He ends up living in Vazelay, which is a fantastic tiny town. It's a great place to be in exile, by the way. So he's in exile in the French countryside. In this kind of isolation, this is the place where he engages in meditation. He turns inward in a different way. He writes in a more personal manner. And then he suffers a different kind of exile when he moves to Carpentras in the south of France, which is an okay town, but he was miserable there. And then later he's living in Orléans. So he's far from the capital. And this impacts the way that he can participate in certain groups. At the very end of his life, when he's deeply ill, he does move back to Paris, sort of briefly. And there's this attempt, this notion of reforming ASIFAL, but it's too late, and he dies. So I think there are different agendas at work in each phase. But Bataille's not really a thinker of exile in the way that someone like Émile Cioran is a thinker of exile, or even someone like Willem Plusser. Bataille is interested in belonging and barriers to belonging. He's cognizant of that. But he was not forced outside or someone that became aware of his outsider status. He didn't use that outsider status in the way that some of these other figures did.
Probably have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions, Max, we'll say. All the way in the back.
Hi, thank you so much for coming out to speak. I was very curious if I understood your sort of line of argument correctly. It sounds like what you've been saying throughout this presentation is that essentially that modernity is sad, essentially that scientific rationalism of the Enlightenment is emotionally and spiritually unsatisfying, and that fascism allows a kind of relief from this sort of existential malaise by allowing people to indulge in the pleasure of their sort of violent and racist impulses by identifying with something larger than themselves. And I'm wondering, to what extent is this different than Walter Benjamin's politics idea of turning fascism into a kind of art, politics into a kind of art? How is this sort of different?
Well, I'm not sure that it is all that different. Benjamin is writing the essay in that you're speaking of. It's translated by Pierre Klosowski, so it's part of the same exact world that Bataille is writing about. This affective politics is something that they are deeply cognizant of and in conversation about. Benjamin is more interested in many of the, let's say, media and outward forms of that. How does this appear? And Bataille is more interested in the psychological aspects of it And we should also say that, Bataille in the early 30s is much more influenced by psychoanalysis than he is. By 1938, he's moving away from psychoanalysis, and he's using more of a sociological model. In another way, though, Bataille enacts this affective politics in things like the novel Blue of Noon. He tries to write a journalistic account of the rise of fascism. It doesn't result in fruition. He writes his sociological essays, psychoanalytical essays, and they too, events move too quickly. So he writes a novel instead. And it's a somewhat inconclusive novel, but it is a novel of the passions. And even that novel, he shops it around. He takes it to Andre Malraux and says, "Can you Gallimard publish this?" And there's consideration of it. But events move too quickly, so that this novel gets put in a drawer and doesn't come out again until 1957, when Bataille edits it to a certain extent. So what I'm arguing here is that Bataille is not interested in necessarily analyzing the aesthetic forms and media in that way. When he writes about art later on, in his book on Lascaux or his book on Manet, he's doing it from a social perspective, but he's not doing it in let's say, a politically motivated, in an activist way that he was writing in the 1930s, whereas that's exactly what Benjamin was doing. Benjamin was pointing to the problem of that, and that is not what Bataille is doing. Though oddly, Bataille did read Brecht enough to throw some references to Brecht into Blue of Noon. So he's aware of that kind of thing as an approach, how it could be used. But Bataille's Nietzscheanism, his sense of tragic consciousness, is too deep in him for him to be interested in using, alienation effects or this kind of thing that might end the affective elements of the work of art. He wants to create tragedies, tragic myth, as opposed to a product that could estrange us and raise our consciousness. So they have different goals.
If I could just add to the Benjamin element here, like the thing that you bring up in your question is something that Benjamin's already isolating in Dilthey and the movement of Leibniz. Like all of this, really, it can obviously Benjamin's going to have his problems with Bataille, and he'll tell him himself what those problems were. He famously stands up. Apparently, according to Klosowski, we don't know how apocryphal this is, but Klosowski told Agamben, and I think he also wrote about it. Vous travaillez pour le fascisme, right? Like you are working for fascism, and this was while Benjamin was putting together the notes on Proust. So he's already writing about vitalism, and he's got this expansive critique of Bergson that he's working on. So anything that's in the realm or framework of sociology or anthropology that takes on the question of base materiality, Bataille's going to be extremely skeptical of. But at the same time, I really want to stress this because I see it all the time that these people had a deep antipathy towards each other. It's just not true. Like if you look at Benjamin's letters to folks at the ISR, you have to take into account that Benjamin is writing to the people who allow him to stay alive. So when he's criticizing Bataille in letters to Adorno, Horkheimer, etc., you have to remember that he's also kind of texting his boss. So all of these folks who say, oh, well, we have these hidden letters where he is kind of critical of Bataille. It's like, well, we come across alternative theses in Bataille's work because we had access to, of the alternative theses in Benjamin's theses on the philosophy of history. They were entrusted to Bataille.
Yeah.
And that kind of trust is remarkable.
And I think that when folks try to say, okay, there was this grand opposition between folks like Benjamin and Bataille, it's just not true. Like, both Benjamin and Bataille were just everywhere. Like, as uncomfortable as it might make us feel, Benjamin hung out with a ton of the people from the cosmic circle. Like, so this sort of black and white, you have the vitalists and then you have the sort of anti-vitalists. That's not how this was. That is a complete fabrication to help us make, I guess Agamben make more sense to us, but even he's difficult to get, right? So we have to be extremely careful with when we're trying to say, well, isn't Benjamin already criticizing this? Like, yes, but he's on a different track, as Kendall already said, and B, they're treating each other like historical documents in a certain way. They're very aware that they're in a very important moment in history. And I think that's part of the reason why they're so forceful with one another. But yeah, I needed to jump in. It's a pet peeve of mine, the whole Benjamin v. Bataille thing.
Mm-hmm. Do we have one or two more questions? Maybe one, so we can get on to the excess portion of the evening, if you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, way in the back. Oh, great. Here we go.
Assuming that excess is kind of gain of function research for teleological possibility, do you think Bataille has ever considered how that will ever be collapsed, or if it's finite and we've reached the top of this S curve?
Bataille does not write about that as a problem. His reading in science is limited, and he had dreams of doing more with it with his friend Georges Ambrosino, but he did not. He didn't go there. It's like your best friend's a physicist. You don't go in there. You let him handle it. So he wanted to write something later that would go into a different, atomic theory and the way that this relates to, the unfolding of matter, the nature of the cosmos.
Well, it's more like an analogy, for that using quantum mechanics as an analogy for a human final end, final observational interference, determination. Is there a finite amount of halos that can be the mediums that we discover? Again, that's halos through excess. That's a question.
Yeah, Bataille actually, as you were just saying, that's really a question for Alexander Kojev, who is thinking about the end of history and thinking about those problems. Bataille wants to get out of the business of thinking of history. He wants to think about the moment, not the future. So he doesn't want to think about where things are leading. He doesn't, even the notion of which I didn't mention earlier, but he doesn't like the notion of duration, for example, Bataille. He thinks that what we need to do is live in the moment, not live for endurance. So he is just not thinking about.
We love durations, though.
Yeah, we love durations. We do love durations, but we don't love duration. We live for the moment. That's what Bataille's goal is. So the point is to get out of that kind of thinking. One of his favorite quotes from Nietzsche is the love of not knowing the future. That's what he wants to cultivate. This notion of chance and the endless play of chance. It's not truly infinite, but it's a glimpse of the infinite that one can have in our ecstasies. And that's where Bataille is going. It's toward that glimpse of the infinite.
Great. Stuart, I want to thank you once again for taking your time, sacrificing your time here with us tonight, morally edifying us, or maybe immorally edifying us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.